I remember one time I was sat in the park and I was just practicing presence. These are the early times when I was first introduced to presence and meditation. I would go to nature. It seemed a lot easier to do that there. So I'd be sat in the park just looking at the trees and the flowers. I used to particularly, I still do, love to watch the wind in the trees and listen to the sound. And I remember seeing a bee on a flower. And by this point, I was already practicing observing my mind and watching what it was doing. And not getting so involved in it, and just observing and learning the mechanism of my mind and what was happening and what would trigger what. Just silent witness to everything that's appearing inside as thoughts and feelings. Even really subtle sensations, I was picking up on them without being pulled into anything. And so I remember I was sat on a bench and this bee came over to the flower, was doing his fingers pollinating. And immediately my mind said something along these lines. It was like, oh, look at this bee and this flower. It's so sad because look at what we're doing to the planet, the pollution. We're probably killing all the bees off, and this flower is so beautiful, but soon there'll be no flowers. All the flowers are going to die, and human beings are so stupid. We're ruining the planet, and it's just such a shame. And I remember just becoming really aware of what was happening, but it was quite seductive to go into that. But I just stopped and said, whoa, right now I'm sitting in the park. There's a beautiful thing that I'm watching here. The bee pollinating a flower. It's in itself is quite beautiful. But my interpretation is very negative and very upsetting, actually. And if I'd allowed that thought process to go on, it would have tumbleweeded into even more, like global warming and oh my God, and all my family, we're all going to die. And I probably wouldn't have noticed until like 5, 10, 15 minutes I could have been in that thought process if it were not for the fact that I was practicing presence and observing my mind and how it works. So a few months before that, my whole day or week could have been ruined just from seeing this bee on this flower. But now it must have been 10 to 20 seconds and I'm back into presence. And I remember doing a test or a little experiment. Let me see what would happen if I watched this bee on this flower without interpreting. So these are the type of practices I found myself doing quite often. And of course, witnessing from silence, a beautiful peace came, a joy came, a connection with the bee and the flower, and a witnessing of their interrelated dependency. And what I observed from this stillness was very different to my mind's interpretation. The experience, if I could put it into words, but it didn't feel like it was thoughts, it was more of a feeling of the unity between the flower and the bee and myself as an observer. I was part of this interaction by being there at that time, by being there. And it was clear to me that the bee and the flower were in fact one, apparently separated. And then I looked around and the other flowers, and then my observation extended out to the sky, the birds, the water, the wind, the sun, the earth. And there was this sense of oneness, this unity of the whole cycle of nature. And then there was a beautiful feeling of joy and peace and love for everything that was happening around me. It was a deep, profound, intuitive sense of being connected with everything else that's connected to each other. And as I was sinking into that feeling, and it wasn't new for me, I'd had glimpses of this before, so as it started to arise, I really just fell back into it, as you would. It's so beautiful. And I had a little memory of how I was interpreting this bee on this flower before. And the contrast between the way my mind was interpreting and then this experience that I was having when I left that interpretation, left that opinion, took my attention away from that foolishness. The contrast, well, you can imagine. This is one out of many experiences I've had when it comes to turning away from the conditioned mind response, because the way that we interpret our world, situations, events, people, even ourselves, the way that we think about things is a conditioned response. If you'd had different experiences or grown up in a different place, then your way that you interpret it will be different. And the reason I'm talking about this now is because as we start to understand why our minds work the way they do, and we start to see how dysfunctional and negative it can be, we're not going to be so quick to invest so much belief and interest and identity into something that is obviously not only causing us suffering, but in fact not even real or true. It's just an interpretation. It's just the way my mind works. For some reason, we don't even have to go into why. We can talk forever about why our minds, about conditioning and how it comes about. But all we really need to understand is that it's not serving me, and it's possible to turn away from that. It's not easy in the beginning because we are very pulled into our opinions, and it gives us a sense of self. And so we feel like this is what I believe, this is how I see it, and what I believe is different to what you believe, and you're wrong and I'm right, and all of a sudden we can go to war now just for an opinion or a perspective. And how silly does that seem now that we know that it's just an opinion? So we can see how much of a godsend it is to become aware of the way we're thinking, to realize that the way that we're thinking is negative, it's dysfunctional, and it's transcendable. Most important, it's transcendable. And how do we transcend it? It's the same. It's always the same. With practice of presence and mindfulness, observing the mind without completely believing in everything that comes up, and seeing what arises out of the state of presence, observing without labeling, judging, or interpreting, just for short periods of time each day throughout the day. For me, one of the best ones is to listen to and look at the wind in the trees. This seems to bring me very deeply into the present moment quite easily and quite quickly. But you'll find your way, you'll find your thing. It just has to be something that's now, something that's present. And it may change from day to day, that's fine. But find that thing that brings you into the present moment and use it. Do it, and life will change. In fact, life doesn't change. You change. The way that you interact with life, it's in the eye of the beholder. It's been said, I don't see the world as it is, I see the world as I am. Because we see the world through the lens or the filter of our psychological conditioning. But that's optional. People sometimes say, be positive, think positively. You can't just switch from negative to positive thoughts. You can, but it won't work, not for long. And still, the root issue is still there. We're still relying on our minds. We're still relying on the middleman. Sometimes I call the mind the middleman, to report to us what it thinks about what's being seen. So I'm seeing the world as it is. So this means that once we see the world as it is, which is beyond interpretation, we start to observe from that silent space as a silent witness. That's when the magic starts. That's when the mystery of life starts to reveal itself to us. So it's always been like that. Life has always been what it is, just as it is. But we have the ability and the tendency to mess it all up. So it's nobody's fault, there's no one to blame. That's just part of the play too. Becoming conditioned and having a mind that works in this way is part of it. But going beyond that is also part of it, part of the human story. So, next time you see a bee on a flower, remember this and just witness, just observe, just enjoy. Love and strength.